Rotten or survive. The truth about Rikers Island meals they don't want you to see. The tray that could kill you. The plastic tray slid under the cell door with a clack. Inside was a slice of meatloaf, gray, cold, and covered in something that looked like oil. A spoon of green beans that weren't green anymore, and a small cup of milk that smelled like bleach. The inmate, known as Dre, stared at it for a long moment. He poked the meatloaf with a plastic spork. It didn't move. He looked at the guard and said, "Yo, this ain't food, man. This poison." The guard didn't answer. He just kept walking. Inside Rikers Island, one of America's most infamous jails, food isn't just about eating. It's about survival. Because here, every meal tells a story of neglect, corruption, and a system that's slowly rotting from the inside out. Welcome to the truth about Rikers Island meals, the part of prison life they don't want you to see. Welcome to the kitchen. The Rikers Island kitchen is bigger than a football field. It feeds over 5,000 inmates every single day, but few outside know what really happens behind those walls. When you first walk in, the air hits you like a wall. It's hot, greasy, and smells like a mix of spoiled meat and cleaning chemicals. Old ovens groan from overuse. Mice scurry under storage shelves. Boxes of expired ingredients sit in corners with faded dates. Most of the cooking isn't done by trained staff, it's done by inmates. Men and women who get up at 3 a.m., put on torn gloves, and cook food they wouldn't even eat themselves. They do it for 16 cents an hour. Dre was one of them. He was assigned to kitchen duty 2 weeks after his arrival. At first, he thought it was better than staying locked in his cell all day. But what he saw changed how he looked at food forever. He remembers opening a fridge that barely worked. Inside were boxes of chicken marked discard. They were slimy, with a sour smell that burned the nose. But one of the older inmates, called Big Lou, just shrugged. "We wash it down, bro, boil it. They'll never know." And they didn't. That same chicken was served that night, chopped into stew, floating in greasy broth. For some, it was their only meal that day. For others, it was the start of food poisoning that sent them straight to the medical unit. But nobody complained. Because at Rikers, complaining about the food can get you more than a stomachache. It can get you a target on your back. The menu of misery. Every week, inmates at Rikers are handed a meal schedule. On paper, it looks decent: oatmeal, eggs, beef stew, turkey sandwiches, even fruit sometimes. But what's on paper and what's on the tray are two very different things. One former inmate described it like this: "They'll say it's turkey, but it's mystery meat. They'll say it's oatmeal, but it tastes like wet cardboard." The food comes frozen in bulk from government suppliers. The lowest bidder wins the contract. That means the cheapest food possible, often rejected from schools or the military. When the boxes arrive, they're stacked high in the loading dock, dripping thawed liquid. The labels read, "For correctional use only." Inside, the contents are gray, overprocessed, and packed with sodium. Everything is made to last, not to taste good, not to nourish, but to survive the paperwork. Dre remembers the breakfast trays the most. Cold eggs that tasted like rubber. Grits that stuck to the spoon. And milk so sour it made grown men gag. "We used to call it the survival test," Dre said. "You eat it, you survive. You skip it, you starve." Some inmates learned tricks, trading commissary ramen noodles to avoid eating from the kitchen. Others just didn't have a choice. If you were broke or locked down in solitary, that tray was all you had. But then came a day that changed everything. A meal that made headlines. A scandal that forced the public to finally look at what Rikers inmates were eating. And that story is where things start to rot for real. The rotten scandal. It started with a photograph. A blurry image taken by an inmate using a smuggled phone. It showed a meal tray, a gray piece of chicken, covered in green mold. Next to it, a slice of bread so hard you could knock on it. And in the corner, a carton of milk, dated 3 weeks expired. The photo leaked to the media through an anonymous guard. Within hours, it spread like wildfire online. Rotten food served at Rikers Island. News outlets picked it up. Former inmates came forward with their own stories. Stories of food crawling with maggots, moldy bread, and meat that smelled like death. One woman, a former inmate named Keisha, described how she got violently ill after eating a chicken patty. "I threw up for 2 days," she said. "When I went to the infirmary, they told me it was just stress. But I knew it was that food. Everyone who ate it got sick." The Department of Correction issued a statement denying the claims, saying, "All meals meet nutritional and safety standards." But inside Rikers, inmates laughed when they heard that. Because the truth was simple. The kitchen was falling apart. Refrigerators broke down constantly. Meat was left sitting for hours before being cooked. And rats, not 1 or 2, but dozens, were often seen crawling under the prep tables at night. Dre remembers one morning when a fellow cook screamed. He lifted a lid from a pot of beans, and out crawled a rat that had drowned in the pot overnight. The sergeant on duty just barked, "Scoop it out. Keep cooking." That's when Dre realized something deeper. This wasn't about food anymore. It was about how much people's lives were worth inside those walls. Because if nobody cared about what went into their bodies, then nobody cared if they lived or died. Survival of the smartest. Word spread fast among inmates, "Don't eat the meat." But what do you do when you're trapped on an island, locked up, and hungry? You adapt. Some inmates became experts at survival. They turned commissary items, ramen noodles, peanut butter, and hot sauce, into full meals. They called it jail gourmet. Dre's cellmate, Bones, was one of the best. He'd crush ramen noodles, mix them with canned tuna, hot water, and a few crushed chips. Add hot sauce, stir it up, and boom, 5-star dinner, Bones would say with a grin. For those who couldn't afford commissary, the struggle was harder. Some traded chores or protection for food. Others scavenged leftovers, even from the trash. Then there were the kitchen hustlers. Inmates who worked in food prep could sneak out small portions, a spoon of peanut butter, an apple, or even raw sugar, and trade it for favors or phone time. But getting caught came with consequences. One night, Dre saw a young inmate, Tyrell, caught hiding a boiled egg in his sock. The guard dragged him out, slammed him against the wall, and sent him to the box, 23 hours a day in solitary. Over an egg. That's when the truth hit Dre. At Rikers, food wasn't just survival. It was currency. It controlled who had power, who stayed alive, and who broke down. And every tray, every spoon of rotten stew, reminded them that they were at the bottom of the chain. Behind the kitchen door. One rainy morning, Dre was cleaning the sink area when he heard a low argument coming from the staff office. 2 officers and a civilian kitchen supervisor were whispering. But in a place like Rikers, whispers always spread. "The supplier's late again. Use the backup batch. That batch is expired, boss. Then scrape off the dates and serve it. Nobody's gonna know." That's how deep it went. Corruption didn't just happen inside the kitchen. It started from the top. Suppliers overcharged the city, sent low-quality food, and pocketed the profit. And the people who were supposed to oversee it all looked the other way. Inmates began keeping notes, dates, meal types, and how many people got sick after each. Dre's list filled 4 sheets of lined paper. He knew it might never leave Rikers. But still, he kept writing. Because he wanted someone, anyone, to see the truth. Then one night, everything changed. An entire housing unit got food poisoning. Over 50 inmates vomited, some fainted. The smell was unbearable. Ambulances rushed to the gate. And for the first time in years, the kitchen shut down. The investigation that followed would expose things far worse than bad chicken or spoiled milk. It would show what happens when a system stops caring about the people it feeds. And that was just the beginning. The investigation nobody wanted. The shutdown made headlines. Rikers inmates fall ill after contaminated meal. That was the headline on every local news station. But what the public didn't know was how much pressure was building behind those walls. Inspectors from the Department of Health arrived on the island days later. They wore white lab coats and gloves, taking photos and samples from the kitchen. To the outside world, it looked like a cleanup, but to the inmates working there, it felt like a cover-up. Dre watched as boxes of old supplies, the same boxes that had been there for months, were suddenly whisked away on carts. Floors were scrubbed. Expired items vanished overnight. And just like that, by the time inspectors returned, everything looked normal. But inmates knew the truth. Nothing had changed. It was all staged. Big Lou whispered to Dre, "They clean for the camera, bro. Then they go back to business." He was right. A week later, the same food was back. Same gray meat. Same smell. The only difference was the fear. Anyone caught talking to an inspector or reporter could get sent to solitary. Still, some took the risk. A few brave inmates slipped written notes into trash bags that left the kitchen. One of those notes made it to a correctional reform advocate named Angela Ortiz, who had been fighting for prison food transparency for years. Angela published the note online. "They feed us garbage. We're humans, not dogs. Please make them see." That post went viral. Soon, city officials couldn't ignore it anymore. A full investigation was ordered, this time led by outsiders. But exposing the truth about Rikers meant uncovering decades of buried secrets. And not everyone was ready for that. Rotten from the top. When investigators started digging into Rikers' food contracts, what they found shocked even seasoned prosecutors. Millions of taxpayer dollars had been spent on food that didn't meet basic safety standards. Suppliers were billing for grade A meat, but delivering discarded leftovers from warehouses. Emails surfaced, showing city officials knew about it. They just didn't want the paperwork or the political heat. Meanwhile, inside Rikers, the tension grew. Guards blamed inmates for lying. Inmates accused the staff of poisoning them. And those working in the kitchen were caught in the middle. Dre began keeping a hidden journal, a mix of recipes, diary entries, and notes on what he saw. One page read, "If this place had cameras in the kitchen, half the city would lose their jobs." But the scariest part wasn't the corruption, it was the silence. Because the more inmates spoke out, the more they disappeared. One man named Rico, who had been helping gather evidence, was suddenly transferred to another facility upstate. No warning, no explanation. His bunk was empty the next morning. Dre realized the system had a way of cleaning up its own mess. Not just rotten food, but rotten truth. Voices in the dark. Months passed. The scandal faded from headlines. Public attention moved on. But inside, the hunger and the silence continued. For Dre and others, hope came from small acts of defiance. They started writing letters, hundreds of them, to advocacy groups, journalists, even City Hall. Some got ignored. Some got returned. But a few got through. Those few letters helped spark a movement. Inmates began to document everything. Dates, meal conditions, even photos smuggled out through visitors. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were witnesses. Their mission, to show the world that correctional didn't mean inhumane. And slowly, the truth began leaking out again. Photos, videos, first-hand stories, all showing the same thing. Rotten food. Sick inmates. Neglect hidden under fluorescent lights. For the first time in decades, the city had to respond. Reforms were promised. New food suppliers were announced. But Dre had seen enough to know better. "They'll fix it for a month," he said quietly. "Then it's right back to the same old stew." He wasn't wrong. Because at Rikers, real change doesn't come with new menus. It comes with accountability. And that's the one thing nobody seemed hungry for. The smell that never leaves. Even after Dre was released, he said the smell followed him. Every time he passed a cafeteria or a hot kitchen, he'd gag. Memories rushing back of spoiled meat boiling in rusted pots. He tried to go back to normal life, but every meal reminded him of survival. He couldn't eat eggs anymore. Couldn't drink milk. Not without seeing those trays. One night, sitting in his apartment, he opened the old notebook he'd smuggled out from Rikers. The pages were stained, the ink faded, but the truth was still there, written in shaky handwriting. "They feed us to keep us quiet, but the hunger never stops. The hunger for justice." Dre decided to do something he never thought he would. He spoke publicly. In front of cameras, reporters, and advocates, he told his story. About the rotten food. About the silence. About what it felt like to be treated like nothing. His voice shook, but he didn't stop. Because for every tray of rotten food that had been served, someone deserved to hear the truth behind it. Still hungry for change. Years later, investigations would still find violations at Rikers. The menus would change, but the conditions rarely did. Even now, the stories continue. Meals served cold, spoiled, or crawling with insects. But something has changed. People are finally listening. Documentaries, lawsuits, and former inmates' testimonies have exposed what was once hidden. And voices like Dre's, voices from the inside, have started to shake the walls that kept the truth locked away for decades. Rikers isn't just a jail. It's a mirror, showing what happens when a system stops seeing people as human beings. And until that changes, the question remains. At Rikers Island, are you eating to live or living to survive? Aftermath of the outcry. The Rikers food scandal didn't fade quietly. After Dre spoke out, local news outlets picked up his story. Within days, his interviews spread across social media. Hashtags like #RikersMeals and #RottenOrSurvive started trending. For the first time, the public saw what inmates had been living with for years. Trays filled with spoiled stew. Moldy bread served in plastic wrap. Milk cartons stamped with dates from weeks before. New Yorkers watching from their apartments couldn't believe it. Is this really happening in our city? One woman said on camera. The shock turned into anger, and the anger turned into pressure. City officials scrambled. The Department of Correction Commissioner called a press conference, promising swift action and new oversight. But Dre, sitting in his small Bronx apartment, watching the same press conference on TV, shook his head. They say new oversight every year, he muttered. Then they go right back to the same rot. He wasn't bitter, just tired. He had lived through it, smelled it, tasted it. He knew how easily the truth gets buried when no one's looking. Still, something was different this time. The story wouldn't disappear so easily. Because more voices were rising. Voices from the inside. The whistleblowers. Inside Rikers, a quiet rebellion began to grow. Some of the kitchen workers, current and former inmates, started leaking details to the media. One anonymous worker sent a photo to a reporter. A huge metal pot filled with brown sludge. The caption read, "This is what they call beef stew. Smells like drain water." Another sent copies of food delivery logs showing expired inventory used months past the date. The receipts matched the story Dre had told. Suddenly, reporters had proof, not rumors, not speculation, proof. The city council demanded an investigation. Inspectors arrived on the island again, this time unannounced. They found rats in storage areas, leaking refrigerators, and unclean trays stacked beside garbage bins. Even worse, there were signs the kitchen was reusing old food, mixing leftovers from one meal into the next day's stew. That finding hit headlines immediately. Rikers kitchen recycled meals across multiple days, inspectors fined. The Department of Health fined the facility, and the city promised to replace the food contractor. But inside the jail, nothing changed overnight. For the inmates, every meal was still a test of luck. And every tray still came with a question. Would this one make me sick, or help me survive another day? Fighting for change. Public pressure grew. Activists protested outside City Hall holding signs that read, "We are what we feed them. Rotten food equals rotten system." Dre was invited to speak at a rally. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even a public speaker. But when he stepped up to the microphone and looked at the crowd, his voice carried the pain of thousands. "When I was inside, I used to pray that one day somebody would care about what we were eating. Not fancy meals. Not steak. Just food that wouldn't make us sick." His voice cracked. You feed a man garbage long enough, he starts to believe he deserves it. That's what Rikers does to you. The crowd clapped, not out of pity, but respect. Because for the first time, the invisible were being heard. That speech went viral. And from that day forward, Dre became a voice for others. The men and women still trapped behind those bars, still facing the same rotten meals, still waiting for change. The politics of reform. Behind the scenes, the system fought back. City officials launched a nutrition reform task force. complete with press releases and photo ops of fresh vegetables and smiling staff. But the inmates laughed. They called it the lettuce show, because cameras only came out when salad was on the menu. In reality, most units never saw those improvements. The new suppliers were the same old companies with new names. The same delivery trucks arrived, just painted with different logos. When a journalist asked Dre what he thought of the reforms, he replied simply, "You can't fix the food if you don't fix the mindset." And he was right, because the problem wasn't only what they served. It was how easily people forgot who they were serving it to. The last tray. Months later, Dre returned to Rikers, not as an inmate, but as an advocate. He walked into the same kitchen where he once worked, now wearing a visitor's badge. The smell hit him first. Same grease. Same old air. He looked around and saw the same metal trays, the same faded floor tiles. But this time, something new was there too. A small group of reporters and activists documenting every corner. Flashbulbs clicked. Pens scribbled. The truth was finally being seen by the world. As Dre stood there, a young inmate carrying a tray passed by. He looked nervous, unsure if he should speak. But then he whispered, "Yo, you the one that talked about the food, right?" Dre nodded. The young man smiled weakly and said, "Thanks for that. They cleaning up a little now. It's still bad, but at least they scared." Dre smiled back, his eyes heavy with emotion. That small moment, that acknowledgement, was worth everything. Because it meant the truth had finally reached the place where it mattered most. Still hungry. Years passed, and Rikers still made headlines, for violence, corruption, and more investigations. But buried under all that noise, a quiet revolution had started. The city began phasing out the old food contracts. Inmates were allowed to give feedback on meals through new oversight committees. And for the first time, prison food became a public issue, not a hidden shame. Still, Dre knew the fight wasn't over. "You can fix the kitchen," he said, "but you can't fix a system that sees hunger as part of punishment." His story, once just one man's truth, became part of a larger movement for reform. And every time someone shared it, another layer of silence cracked. Because change doesn't come from speeches or cameras. It comes from voices that refuse to stay quiet. The man who spoke for the silent. After the cameras stopped flashing and the reporters moved on, Dre stayed committed. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be heard, really heard. He started volunteering with a reentry program in the Bronx, helping newly released inmates adjust to life outside. Most of them came out broken, not just mentally but physically. Many had the same story: stomach problems, lost weight, and fear of food. One man told Dre, "I still can't eat eggs, bro. Every time I smell him, I think of that tray." It reminded Dre that even though he was free, the system still lived inside them. He turned that pain into purpose. He began writing letters, speaking to advocacy groups, and testifying before city officials. When the New York City Council held a hearing on correctional reform, Dre stood before them, suit, tie, and trembling hands. He wasn't a politician. He was a man who had eaten the truth they all ignored. "You feed us garbage, you get garbage results," he said. "We can't expect men to come out better when we treat them like they don't matter." The room went silent. For the first time, the people making the rules had to look into the eyes of someone who had lived them. The system pushes back. But telling the truth always comes with a price. Dre's name started appearing in places he didn't expect. Online forums, correctional union discussions, even leaked emails. Some called him a liar. Others said he was exaggerating for attention. A few even hinted that his words were making the city look bad. He received one anonymous letter that said, "You had your time here. Stop digging up old dirt." But Dre didn't stop. Because it wasn't just his story, it was every inmate who couldn't speak. The ones who got sick, who stayed silent, who never made it out. He started working with a small documentary crew that wanted to bring his story to life. They filmed interviews with former inmates, kitchen workers, and even a retired guard who finally broke his silence. The guard said, "We all knew. We all saw it. But saying something meant losing your job. I'm retired now, so I'll say it plain. Those meals were a disgrace. That confession became the moment the film's tone shifted, from testimony to proof. The documentary that shook the city. When the documentary premiered, titled Rotten or Survive, Inside Rikers Island's Meals, it hit harder than anyone expected. The film didn't just show images, it felt like Rikers. The sound of trays clanging, the echo of cell doors, the way inmates laughed at their own misery just to stay sane. Audiences left theaters silent, some in tears. The documentary spread online, gaining millions of views in weeks. Teachers showed it in classrooms. Advocacy groups used it in presentations. It forced New Yorkers to confront a reality they couldn't unsee. The film ended with Dre standing outside Rikers' main gate, looking back at the island. His voice narrated, "That place took everything from me, my hunger, my trust, my peace. But it also gave me a mission, to make sure no one ever eats in fear again." That line became iconic. People quoted it in tweets, posts, and speeches. And for the first time, the name Rikers Island wasn't just a symbol of violence. It was a symbol of what needed to change. The change begins. Months after the documentary, City Hall announced new food reform initiatives. The contract with the old supplier was canceled. A new partnership was formed with local community farms and food programs. They promised fresh vegetables, inspected meat, and transparent meal reports. But Dre knew one thing: promises are easy. Proof is hard. He insisted that independent monitors, not prison staff, should oversee the kitchen. That idea got approved. For the first time in Rikers history, civilian inspectors were allowed into the kitchen weekly. They could photograph, report, and publish what they found. And what they found changed everything. The trays were cleaner. The smell was gone. The food wasn't perfect, but it was edible, even decent. For the men inside, it was more than food. It was a message. You are seen. The return. A year later, Dre visited the island again. He wasn't a visitor this time. He was part of an advocacy team conducting inspections. As he walked through the corridors, memories flooded back. The noise, the tension, the faces pressed against cell doors. But something small, almost invisible, felt different. A young inmate recognized him from the documentary. He smiled and said, "Yo, Dre. The food better now, bro. They got real chicken this week." Dre laughed, eyes wet with pride. That one line, "They got real chicken," was more than a joke. It was progress. He took a moment before leaving, looking through the gate one last time. For years, that gate meant confinement. Now it meant change. The legacy of hunger. Even after Rikers is eventually shut down, as planned by the city, Dre's story will remain. Not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. Because what happened inside that kitchen wasn't just about food. It was about how easily a system can forget that people behind bars are still human. Every rotten tray. Every spoiled carton. Every inmate who whispered, "This ain't right." They were all part of a truth too powerful to stay hidden. Dre's story proved that real change doesn't start with laws or budgets. It starts when someone decides to tell the truth, no matter who tries to silence them. From one voice to a movement. Dre's story didn't end with Rikers Island. After the documentary's success, he began traveling, not for fame, but for awareness. He visited county jails in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, each one telling him the same story with different names. Rotten food. Underpaid inmate cooks. Spoiled milk passed off as nutritious. And systems that looked away until someone got sick. He realized Rikers was never the only one. It was just the one that finally got caught. He started a foundation called the Hunger for Justice Project. Its mission was simple but powerful: to make sure no inmate in America goes hungry for dignity. Through donations and advocacy, they funded independent inspections of prison kitchens, pushed for public transparency, and gave a platform to inmates willing to speak out. What began as one man's pain became a national movement. Former inmates, families, correctional officers, even some wardens, joined in. They all agreed on one truth: you can't fix a broken person with broken food. Dre wasn't just fighting for cleaner meals anymore. He was fighting for respect, The kind that says, "You're still human, no matter where you are." The island still speaks. Years later, the city finally began closing down Rikers Island, piece by piece. The same island that once stood as a symbol of punishment was now being dismantled. But Dre never celebrated it like a victory. He visited the shoreline one last time, standing under gray clouds, the wind cutting across the East River. He could see the faint outline of the island in the distance, silent, decaying, almost swallowed by fog. A reporter beside him asked, "Do you feel like you won?" Dre smiled softly. "Nobody wins when people have to starve for justice. I didn't win, we just finally got them to listen." He paused, looking out at the horizon. "That island took my hunger once, but it also gave me a purpose. And that's something they can't lock away." Rotten or survive. The story of Rikers Island meals isn't just about food, it's about what happens when a system forgets empathy. When cost becomes more important than care. When silence becomes easier than change. Dre's journey proves something vital. Change doesn't begin in boardrooms or city halls. It begins in the voices of the forgotten, echoing through concrete walls until the world can't ignore them anymore. From the stench of rotten stew, to the courage it took to speak up, to the reforms that are slowly spreading across America, this story reminds us of one thing. Humanity doesn't stop at the prison gate. Rikers may one day be gone, but its lessons about greed, neglect, and the fight for dignity will live on. Because every meal served behind bars is a reflection of the society serving it. And when we finally learn to feed with compassion, we might just start to heal the hunger that exists both inside and outside those walls.